In the summer of 1945, in a secluded British interrogation center known as Trent Park, Germany's highest-ranking captured generals were asked a simple question. Which Allied commander did they fear the most? These were the men who had faced Montgomery in the desert, Bradley in France, and felt the weight of Eisenhower's entire coalition. Yet name after name, from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt to General Heinrich von Wiedenhoff, gave a surprising answer. It wasn't the meticulous planner of D-Day or the victor of El Alamein. It was George S. Patton. But they weren't talking about his ivory-handled pistols. They were talking about a specific quality the German High Command found uniquely dangerous. That dangerous quality would be weaponized in a way few could have predicted. This is the story of how one general's reputation became a strategic asset, arguably more powerful than his own army at the most critical moment of the war. Using declassified intelligence and the general's own post-war testimony, we will separate the man from the myth that the Germans themselves helped create. This leads to the central question of our investigation. Was Patton's greatest contribution to victory in Europe a battle he never actually fought, commanding an army that didn't even exist? To understand how a general's reputation could become a weapon, we must first understand the battlefield of the mind. For the German High Command in the winter of 1944, that battlefield was a map of northern France, clouded by dread. The invasion was no longer a question of if, but when, and most critically, where. Every scrap of intelligence, every weather report, every radio intercept was scrutinized for the answer. The fate of Germany in the West did not rest on the much-publicized Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander, knew the truth. It was a thin concrete crust, a defensive line formidable in propaganda photos, but dangerously shallow in reality. It could slow an invasion, but it could not stop one. The real defense, the decisive weapon, was the strategic reserve, the elite panzer divisions held deep inland. These were the armored fists Hitler kept ready to deliver a single, overwhelming counterattack. A mailed fist that could only strike one place, one time. This created a paralyzing strategic dilemma. If the German command guessed the landing zone correctly and unleashed the panzers at the first sign of invasion, they could annihilate the beachhead and throw the Allies back into the English Channel. But if they guessed wrong, if they committed their armored reserve to the wrong sector while the main landing happened elsewhere, the beachhead would be secured. Allied troops and materiel would pour into France, the Second Front would be a reality, and Germany would be crushed in a vice. It was a single binary choice upon which the entire war in the West depended. The Allied planners understood this German anxiety perfectly. They knew that getting ashore was only half the battle. The other half was a grand deception, a psychological operation designed to manipulate the mind of the German High Command itself. Their invasion plan had to be more than a feat of logistics. It had to be a masterpiece of misdirection. And for the centerpiece of that masterpiece, they would need an actor the Germans would find utterly convincing. The actor they chose was General George S. Patton. After his 7th Army's rapid advance across Sicily, his name was already a legend, the Allies' most audacious and feared practitioner of armored warfare. But by early 1944, Patton was also a man in disgrace. In August 1943, he had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, and the ensuing scandal nearly ended his career. He was sidelined in England, a 4-star general with no army to command. Most commanders would have been sent home, but Allied Supreme Command saw a unique opportunity in the crisis. They wouldn't hide their most controversial general. They would do the opposite, put him on public display, making his notoriety the centerpiece of the most ambitious deception in military history, Operation Fortitude. The plan was audacious, to convince the Germans that Patton was preparing to lead the main invasion force. And to sell that lie, the Allies would have to build him an army worthy of his reputation, even if it was made of rubber and air. The army they built for him was a masterpiece of illusion. Across the fields of Kent and Essex, in the corner of England closest to France, a ghost force materialized. This was the First U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. From the air, German reconnaissance planes saw exactly what the Allies wanted them to see: vast motor pools filled with hundreds of Sherman tanks. But on the ground, these tanks were inflatable rubber decoys, some so poorly made they would sag after a rainstorm. They saw sprawling camps capable of housing 1 million men, but the barracks were empty shells. They saw harbors choked with landing craft ready for the channel crossing, but they were little more than canvas and wood frames designed by movie set artists. This was more than just props. A dedicated unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, orchestrated the illusion. They created and distributed thousands of fake shoulder patches for the non-existent divisions of FUSAG. They drove trucks in circles to create the appearance of heavy traffic, and most importantly, they filled the airwaves with a symphony of fake radio traffic, meticulously simulating the day-to-day communications of a massive army group preparing for the decisive blow. At the head of this spectral force, the Allies placed their most tangible, most aggressive, and most believable weapon, General Patton himself. His assignment to command FUSAG was made deliberately public. For months he played his part to perfection. He was photographed constantly, touring his phantom units, reviewing non-existent troops, and giving his trademark fiery speeches, all within the geographical box of southeast England. For the German analysts watching from across the Channel, this was not a random detail. It was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. Their own doctrine was built on the concept of the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of main effort, and their own analysis told them the only logical Schwerpunkt was the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route to Germany. A high-speed armored assault on Calais required the Allies' premier expert in high-speed armored assault. That expert was Patton. The bait was taken. The German High Command wasn't just fooled. They were led to a conclusion they were already predisposed to believe. Their own intelligence reports had long identified the Pas-de-Calais as the most probable invasion site. Patton's presence there simply confirmed their bias. Post-war interrogations reveal the depth of this conviction. General Gunther Blumentritt, the chief of staff for the entire Western Front, stated bluntly that the German command considered Patton the most dangerous man on the Allied side, their expert in mobile, large-scale operations. They firmly believed, he said, that the main invasion would be where Patton was. His reputation alone was enough to anchor 15 German divisions, including elite panzer units, in the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. But the Allies weren't just relying on rubber tanks and a general's reputation. They were actively manipulating the flow of information into the heart of the German intelligence service itself. Through a sophisticated operation known as the double-cross system, every single German agent operating in Britain had been captured and turned by MI5. These double agents now served as a direct pipeline for Allied disinformation. The most valuable of them all was a Spanish national, Juan Pujol García, codenamed GARBO by the British and Alaric by the Germans. The Germans believed he was their master spy, controlling a network of 27 loyal sub-agents across Britain. In reality, the network was a complete fiction, and every one of his meticulously detailed reports was crafted by his British handlers. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, GARBO sent over 500 radio messages to Berlin, confirming the massive strength of FUSAG and detailing Patton's supposed plans for the assault on Calais. The German High Command treated his intelligence as gospel. They weren't just being tricked by what they could see. They were being lied to by the very spies they trusted most. The deception was a work of art, a complex machine of physical illusion, psychological warfare, and intelligence counterplay. But its stunning success wasn't just a testament to Allied ingenuity. It worked because it exploited a fatal flaw buried deep within the command structure of the Third Reich, a structural weakness that made the German leadership uniquely vulnerable to this grand deception. The deception didn't just fool intelligence analysts, it reached the very top, validating the preconceived notions of Adolf Hitler himself. By 1944, Hitler increasingly distrusted his professional officer corps, relying instead on what he called his intuition. The story of Patton, the Allies' most aggressive commander, poised to strike at the Pas-de-Calais, was a narrative that made perfect sense to him. This meant that accurate military reasoning was being overruled by ideology. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, inspecting the defenses in Normandy, grew deeply concerned that this was the real target, but his warnings were lost in the command structure. The German High Command wasn't simply a passive victim of a trick. They were active participants in their own delusion, clinging to the Calais theory, because Patton's Ghost Army gave them the perfect justification. And so, on the eve of the largest amphibious invasion in history, the German command was fixated on a phantom. They were watching the wrong general, in the wrong place, preparing for the wrong battle. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the illusion shattered. As thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, German commanders on the ground sent frantic calls up the chain of command. They needed the panzer reserves, and they needed them now. The invasion could still be crushed on the beaches. But at his headquarters, miles from the chaos, Hitler was unshakable. This was the diversion. The main attack, Patton's attack, was still to come at the Pas-de-Calais. The order was clear. The powerful German 15th Army, nearly 200,000 men and hundreds of tanks, was to remain in place. For critical hours, then for days, then for more than 6 weeks after D-Day, the single greatest threat to the Allied beachhead sat completely idle, just a few hours' drive away. They were held fast by a ghost, waiting for a general who wasn't there, for an attack that would never materialize. This was the moment the entire deception was built for. The paralysis of the German counterattack gave the Allies the one thing they couldn't buy: time. Time to land, time to regroup, and time to secure their fragile foothold in Fortress Europe. The words of those captured generals in Trent Park now take on their true, chilling meaning. When men like von Rundstedt spoke of Patton's unique danger, they weren't paying tribute to a battlefield myth. They were acknowledging defeat by a weapon they never saw coming, an idea. The very idea of Patton, aggressive, unpredictable, and unstoppable, was enough to paralyze the entire German 15th Army. His greatest contribution to the victory in Europe was not a battle won with tanks and guns. It was a silent, psychological triumph that ensured the Normandy landings would not fail, and in doing so, sealed the fate of the Third Reich in the West. Ultimately, the Germans were not defeated by the army Patton would eventually lead into battle. They were defeated by the one they only imagined, an army built not of steel and soldiers, but of the very idea of Patton himself.